Let's get started. One, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate you showing up. I'm Devin Stein, for those of you who don't know me, founder and CEO of Dosu, and also open source maintainer for SOPs, customized SOPs, and Spark Magic, which I'll be talking a bit about today. And so today, we're going to be talking about the case for building closed source AI dev tools for open source maintainers and enterprises. So this talk was partially inspired by this tweet/interaction on Twitter. For those of you who maybe didn't see this, this is the maintainer of Zod, a popular open source library, jokingly tweeting basically, can someone make a product for open source maintainers to help them save time on issue triage and documentation? And then, quickly, shortly after his reaction, when he found out that a product like this actually does exist and we've built it. And the reason, one, he didn't think anyone would build this, and then two, was so surprised when there was a product for him, was, open source maintainers aren't exactly, a huge market for startups to go after. It's a relatively tiny population of developers. They have very low willingness to pay. And then, as a maintainer myself, I can say that they're, very opinionated group of developers as well. Not the easiest people to please. But we chose to, work with and sell to open source maintainers and enterprises, and it's been really effective strategy for us. And I think it both helps open source maintainers and enterprises, and I want to get into kind of the details of how we ended up doing this and what's worked for us, and we'll go from there. Just to set some context about Dosu, for those of you who also don't know, Dosu is an AI native knowledge tool for engineering teams. And so what this means is we make it really, really easy to generate documentation sort of as a byproduct of building as developers build or from wherever they work. We make it extremely easy to maintain knowledge and documentation, to actually keep it in sync as code changes. Dosu will review changes for your code with respect to your knowledge base. And then importantly, we actually help you make use of your knowledge. So we share it wherever it's needed, whether that's Slack or Microsoft Teams, or in the case of open source, in GitHub issues and discussions. And so when, if we rewind 2 years ago, and I think this is still true today, the typical dev tool strategies, when you're thinking about sort of companies, you either go open source and you're saying, we're going to build an amazing open source tool library that developers love, and we're going to have product-led growth and figure out how to monetize it. And then the other side is, okay, we're actually going to build a closed source tool and going to be very, very focused on enterprise and focus on sales-driven growth. When I started Dosu, I decided to do, I guess, a hybrid of the two, and where we would build a product for open source maintainers and enterprises that's closed source, but focus on product-led growth. And the reason for this, both why closed source and also why open source maintainers. For why closed source, I wanted to open source Dosu when I started. I love open source, but if you think back to where we were 2 and a bit years ago, this was spring 2023 when I was making this decision, the AI landscape was rapidly evolving, even faster than it is today. ChatGPT was only a few months old. GPT-4 had just come out, and people were worried about losing their jobs. And I knew the problem that we wanted to solve, but I wasn't sure the shape of the product. And when you have an open source, the power of open source is that it is often an accelerant to get you to where you want to be on the product side or vision side, because you have a community and collective intelligence of developers to tap into. But if you are unsure of what the future is, then you end up with a lot more stakeholders that you have to manage as you react to the fast-changing landscape. And it also helped us, our goal is to build a business, so it helped us focus on the common problems between open source maintainers and enterprises, and not get too pushed in either direction. And then also, it's much easier to go from closed source to open source, and I hope we do, than vice versa. As we'll get into more, like the most important thing when working in open source is trust, and you don't want to lose that. And then why open source maintainers? At the time, the AI tooling was fairly new, and it was very slow getting started in enterprises because of concerns around security. And versus within open source, it's already public, and so there's a much lower barrier to entry. And we wanted to get a product into market quickly and get feedback. And open source maintainers are amazing early adopters. They like building things, and they also like using new tools. Like I mentioned before, they're also underserved. There's not a lot of people coming to open source maintainers and saying like, hey, can we solve your problems? And if you are able to solve these problems, they're a very outspoken minority. They have a very large voice in the community, despite the relatively few number of developers. And lastly, as an open source maintainer, I selfishly wanted to build this for myself. And then there were, this wasn't unprecedented. I think two, notable examples of very successful companies that have pursued this strategy is obviously GitHub. I mean, GitHub's foundational to, kind of the open source ecosystem that exists today because of the collaboration features that they built into GitHub. And maybe less known as Jira also actually got started doing the same strategy where they gave Jira to free to open source projects to help them with project management because that was a bigger need back then. And you can still see this in the Apache Software Foundation today where they still use Jira. And so, I guess fast forward 2 years, it's been a very successful strategy for us. We've grown a ton, both within open source and enterprises. And like the kind of three lessons that we've learned is one is like, really around focus on the problem between open source and enterprises. Two is trust is everything, and I'll get into more there. And then, the third is like, you actually have to build something people want and deliver results. And so first is the common problem, which is, my motivation to start Dosu was that I found myself as an open source maintainer and as a senior engineer at companies in a pretty similar position where I spent a lot of my time answering questions and sharing my knowledge and context. Whether in open source this meant waking up to many GitHub notifications where people were blocked because they were waiting on my response. In enterprises, it's my day-to-day life, it was really coming in with the expectation that I was going to be coding all day, and then reality hits, and I was being pinged about questions about something I built or owned or something on my team, or something's wrong, and people understand like what's changed recently. And this has a big impact on developers in both positions. In enterprises, there's lots of studies about kind of developer satisfaction and developer burnout is related to time being spent on non-coding tasks. And same thing happens within open source. Over 60% of maintainers have considered quitting, a lot because of this burden that exists on maintainers. Fun fact is like Lodash maintainer at one point just declared issue bankruptcy and cleared a backlog of 4,000 issues because of this kind of burden. And then, once you identify a common problem, the next is really focusing on trust. We work really, really closely with maintainers to get Dosu off the ground. And this is always important, but I think particularly important when looking at open source and AI. There have been incidents over the past 2 years where folks in the open source have tried to use open source as a way to kind of distribute their product without consulting maintainers, or worse, making issues, in this case, for training data and evaluation purposes, but actually creating real issues that had real impact on hundreds of maintainers. And I was, very happy to see us called out in this article as a quote-unquote good AI company, in that, they had a very different experience working with us because, from day one, we kind of reached out, talked to them about the Dosu, the problem we're solving, and made sure, we're aligned on the same team of helping save them time. And continuing this has been, collaborations with, one, just talking to maintainers. I've spoken to hundreds of maintainers over the past 2 years, trying to, help them understand the ways that they can use AI to automate work and take things off their place, and as well as introducing it safely into their community. And as part of this, we saw sort of natural partnerships emerge where we were the first sort of AI-approved app for the Apache Software Foundation, which was spearheaded by Apache maintainers. We also built out a partnership with the CNCF to help CNCF projects leverage Dosu. And if you haven't seen already, we've done a little partnership with them at KubeCon called Ask CNCF, where you can ask questions about the Cloud Native Computing Foundation as well as the KubeCon events. And then lastly, on the trust side, was really building kind of controls and customization into the product. Every open source community is different, and maintainers wanted ways to customize or tailor Dosu to meet their needs, whether it's kind of response guidelines, or I think the biggest kind of leap for us was basically being able to preview Dosu on your open source project without any impact to end communities. So you could easily simulate running Dosu on a bunch of issues, see how it would react, publish some to GitHub, gradually introduce it to your community to build trust for you, and as well as your end users with the tool, was a huge for our growth. And then all this has to, at the end of the day, come down to delivering results. We have been amazed at the impact that Dosu's had across many open source communities, both from the end users and on the maintainer side. We recently published a few case studies, one with the Dockling project, which is a Linux Foundation project that has blown up recently. Their growth has been staggering, and they were very early adopters of Dosu, and we helped them scale pretty impressively from 0 to 40,000 stars and thousands and thousands of issues in a few months, because their community got to know and use Dosu as a way to meet their needs and unblock them. And similarly, we had an interesting story that I found really powerful and speaks to kind of the general vision around knowledge management, where there was a project called Trillium, and it was abandoned by the maintainer, and there was users of it that wanted to revive the project. And after 2 years, they finally got control of the project, but they didn't have the context that the maintainer had of all the historic issues, and they had a backlog of about 1,000 issues to work through before they could start building out new features. And they were able to leverage Dosu to kind of work through this backlog very quickly, give tools to users to help them self-serve and unblock themselves, and then the maintainers themselves were able to focus on pushing the project forward, setting vision, building new features. Cool. So in conclusion, one thing that was surprising to me is I was very concerned. I was would open source maintainers be okay with a product that is not open source? And the answer is yes. If you solve a problem that they have, you're able to kind of earn and build and maintain trust with them and deliver results, then they're more than happy to use your product. And then two is what I really want to take away is this. Actually, I think is a very effective business strategy for startups that also helps strengthen the open source ecosystem. You end up helping save maintainers valuable time, reduce maintainer burnout, and in exchange, open source maintainers give you what has become for us a real flywheel for product distribution, where developers and enterprises alike discover Dosu when engaging with open source communities, and they can see the product in action, which makes a big difference, especially in this AI world where there's a lot of hype, and when people can see the impact that we've had across projects, we can help differentiate ourselves. So I would encourage people, if you see a problem, especially if you're a maintainer yourself, and you see a problem between your work in open source and in your work at an enterprise or on your team, and you think there's a solution that can meet both needs, to pursue that. So with that, thank you. There's I guess 2 QR codes here. One, if you haven't checked out Ask CNCF, I would highly recommend it. And then if you want to chat with us, whether you want to use Dosu for open source or for enterprises, would love to talk. Yes. Any questions?
So I'm a little curious about if we were to leverage something like Dosu in an existing repository, existing code base that it goes in and build retroactively, rather than with code actually developing it, what does that look like in those two different frames?
Yeah, very, very good question. So for those who didn't hear, the question was, what does it look like to adopt Dosu for an existing project versus one that's net new that kind of helps you generate from the beginning? And both use cases are supported. Essentially, when building out for the legacy use case, you either can, the first step is essentially connecting all your relevant data sources. So in the open source sense, a lot of that data already exists. So when Dosu's connected, we'll index your prior GitHub issues, pull requests, obviously code, and other conversation data sources, maybe from a community Slack or Discord, and sort of help build out that knowledge base by suggesting documentation that you don't have, but is being discussed, or there's changes related to, and can give you tools to sort of generate documentation for features that like very, very easily. You say, hey, we have this part of this code base, it's not documented. You can use Dosu to kind of bootstrap it. The other side, on the enterprise side, we often see is they have a bunch of existing documentation, and so they want to gut check like how much of this is stale, and so we can help identify stale docs, help you update them, so you can establish a better baseline that you then can move forward with. Yeah. Divine.
Data sources, right? So like what kind of data sources are supported?
Yeah, so great question. So question for those who didn't hear was what data sources are supported. So the way Dosu works at a high level is we look at code, conversations, commits, and tickets. And so loosely, support those data sources. So that can be kind of GitHub as a source of code. In open source, it's kind of GitHub is all encompassing. Within enterprises, that looks like GitHub, Slack, or Microsoft Teams as your communication channel, Jira, Linear as your ticketing system, and then your documentation platform could be Confluence or Notion. So that's roughly the integrations we support, but we're constantly building new ones. So if there's ever integrations that are interesting or important, let us know. Like Discord's our number one request right now we're working on. So.
I'll just get it.
Okay.
When it's creating documentation, is it helping define the documentation architecture? Like, if there's a new document that needs to be created that doesn't really fit the current architecture, does it try to assume something, or does it work with the underlying information architecture?
So the question was, when it's generating documentation, does it kind of respect or use like how does it fit into the existing information architecture? So this is a really interesting kind of area of the product that we're actively iterating on and exploring, because when it comes to maintaining documentation, one of the key challenges is actually information architecture, because that has to evolve as your product evolves. So right now, the way we think about generating documentation is we basically work within the existing information architecture would be the short way, but we want to build, we're trying to rethink what it means to basically organize documentation in sort of an LLM first world where maybe your information hierarchy isn't as rigid, because I think that would help with the maintenance problem if you could say, maybe have different views of your knowledge based off user intent, because that is usually what an information hierarchy reflects, is like, what is the user's goal? How do I want to organize this information? So right now we work within existing hierarchies, but we're very interested in exploring a world where information hierarchy is a little bit more fluid. Yeah.
So documentation, right? That's version alongside code.
Where's the
Versioning of documentation
yeah? So
code as the code changes.
as in, where does the documentation live?
Like how would you manage version of documentation?
Manage versioning.
Version, yeah.
Yes. So because there's actually, it's kind of cool, like the way we manage knowledge, because it roughly follows the life cycle of code. It tracks very much with how you think about versioning code. And so there's, as code is changed, so is your knowledge, and that revision is also captured, and the corresponding commit/PR that made that update's also captured. And so we're working on better first-class support where we have tagging versions along the lineage of knowledge as well. But yeah, it's like it follows Git in a lot of ways, the same kind of branching pattern. Yeah. Oh.
Since you mentioned where the documentation lives,
Yeah.
are there public documentations for certain sort of projects that we can look at, or where do they actually live?
Yeah, so I mean, you could check out our docs. So docs.dosu.dev is an example. There's other, Bluefin, I think, is another good example of public-facing Dosu docs. But the way they kind of manifest on the open source side, especially, it's more of a knowledge base than a traditional docs site, because we are, we want to integrate with existing documentation as well. And so some of that might live in Markdown files in your GitHub repo. Some of it might live in other places. And Dosu is kind of a central hub to see and interact with all of that. Yeah.
Can it be deployed on a restricted or air-gapped environment? And where does the knowledge base live? And can it pull information from, let's say, logs or debug support bundles?
Are you able to repeat that?
Can it be deployed? Can your product be deployed on an air-gapped or a restricted environment? That's my first question. And can it pull information from support bundles, logs, or event history?
Okay, so I think it was the second question around, can it pull from logs and support channels?
And where do you store this information, this knowledge base?
So right now, Dosu is a SaaS product, and so it's we host it. It's multi-tenant and SOC 2 compliant. We are thinking about, and I think part of our open source strategy is what does it look like to self-host Dosu? From maybe it's you manage the data, we manage the kind of the models and the agent part. It's something we're actively thinking about is kind of data tenancy within Dosu.
Okay, got you. Thank you.
What about documentation and technical writers? Where was this begin?
So for technical writers, I see Dosu is very complementary. The interesting thing about especially documentation that we focus on is often internal documentation or more like tribal knowledge that isn't things that is documented. So within open source projects, you all have good maybe user-facing documentation, but then there's a lot of sort of troubleshooting knowledge that gets lost in PRs and issues, and so we help there. And then in enterprises, most teams don't have a technical writer, and so they like Dosu is able to help them kind of bootstrap or generate docs and better documentation practices when they, before it's just the responsibility relies on them. For technical writers, Dosu is a tool to keep them in the loop as well. A big thing that technical writers are interested in is basically they want more control, similar to actually the feature we built for open source, which is rather than automatically updating docs, can they suggest updates for technical writers, and then writers can do the final push. Yeah. Yes.
Not a question, but a follow-up that would be my last question, and I was able to sign up when my repo is already indexing.
Thank you, Dosu engineers. Very happy to hear that. So are we measuring ROI from the open source side? Very good question. So we loosely do, right? At like a high level from product metrics, we think about like growth, so top of funnel, like how many people are discovering Dosu every month, how many of them are signing up, creating accounts, and then of those, how many of those are converting to active users, and then from there, retention. And so for open source for us is really about top of funnel. You know, it's like how do we make sure more people are able to discover Dosu? How do we make sure, and like what does that look like from a conversion perspective? And then how do we also make sure that open source maintainers are retaining, meaning they are getting value from the product? Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is the kind of beautiful thing on the flywheel side is like, I mean, Dosu's been in production for over 2 years, and LLMs have improved a lot since then, and Dosu's improved a lot since then. And so you can kind of see this history of how the product's evolved over time in the public. And as the product improves, basically those conversion rates also improve. And that's very, very measurable, which is cool. Awesome. Well, thank you all again for coming. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of KubeCon. And before I forget, we have some t-shirts if anyone wants swag. We have a lot of t-shirts, so please come and get one. And then also feel free to come up and chat. I'll be hanging around. So thank you.